Hello and welcome to First Things First. Today we're going to cover the benefits of identifying and dealing with potential pitfalls that could disrupt your plans for having your dream retirement. Hi, I'm Erin Botsford. I want to thank the financial advisor who invited you to view this important discussion. They obviously care about you and want you to enjoy a future with the least amount of worry and fear. And I found the best way to do that is to anticipate surprises that could come along and disrupt your plans for a wonderful, comfortable retirement or whatever your financial goals might be. So let's get started. Now, if you're like me, your life and the way you make decisions about everything, including money, is a result of the many experiences you've already had. Now, it's likely some of those experiences have been good and maybe some of them have been bad, but clearly and often unconsciously, they've had an impact on the way you look at the world and how you formulate your decisions. Now, when it comes to making decisions about your money, you can't help but be guided by certain things. Maybe what you've read or you've heard, lessons you learned personally or by watching others, experiences from early in your childhood or beliefs you were taught by your parents or other people as you grew up. Now, in my case, in addition to the more traditional ways a person develops their beliefs about money, several personal experiences early in my life shaped my goals, my career, and the way I counsel clients on managing their money. And I hope sharing these experiences with you will highlight some of the financial planning work you've already done, or perhaps items you need to address with the advisor who invited you to watch this videos. Now, the first time tragedy struck in my life, I was just 11 years old. I grew up in a comfortable, middle-class home in the Midwest with very loving parents. My father was a highly educated man, a psychology professor in the Chicago area, but he'd always dreamed of opening a clinic for early childhood education in Southern California. Now, in his efforts to realize his dream and also create a better life for our family, he took a leap of faith. He quit his job and he borrowed against his teacher's pension plan to move our family out to the West. He took a job selling cars to earn money while he waited for his teaching certificate to arrive. Unfortunately, it never did. 6 months after we moved to California, my father collapsed. He died of a massive heart attack on Valentine's Day in front of my mother, my 5 siblings, and me. My dad was only 50 years old. In an instant, our lives changed forever. My father left our family a mere $10,000 from a life insurance policy. That was it. Now, he never imagined he wouldn't be there to realize his dreams or provide for the family he cherished. And since he'd borrowed against his teacher's pension plan, there was no benefit for our family there either. So we went from basically middle class to broke overnight. And from that day forward, everybody in my family had to go to work. My mother needed all of us to pull our weight financially just to keep the lights on. I got my first job before I turned 12, and from a young age, I had to learn the power of a strong work ethic. You probably know what that is. Now, in our case, we were barely scraping by when unfortunately tragedy struck again. I was 16 years old. I was driving to my first real job at McDonald's when I was involved in a terrible accident with a motorcyclist. The driver of the motorcycle unfortunately was killed, and as a result, I was charged with involuntary manslaughter. My mother and I met with an attorney, and we were honest about our family's financial situation. Now, after hearing our story, the attorney spoke to my mom as if I wasn't even there. He said, "Mrs. McGowan, this is purely a matter of economics. If your daughter will plead guilty to these charges of involuntary manslaughter, I'll be happy to enter the plea at no cost to you, and she'll get whatever sentence the state of California hands down. But if she wants to defend herself, it's going to cost you a lot of money." Well, since we had no money, my mother realized in an instant our choices were limited. She literally picked up her purse, she stood up, and she thanked the attorney. She agreed with his advice that I had no option other than to plead guilty. I was literally horrified I started crying and I was begging my mom. I was pleading with her. And that's when my mom looked at me and said the 10 words I will never forget. She said, honey, we have no money and therefore we have no choice. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the day that I learned this very valuable lesson. Money buys you choices or the lack thereof. Now, you may have experienced something similar that demonstrated this life's lesson. I don't know. Well, the good news was the case wasn't closed. My older brother, Tim, who was all of 22 years old at the time, had just begun his real estate career. He suggested that we take out a second mortgage on our family home to pay for our defense. So with the money from that second mortgage, our attorney was able to bring in expert witnesses who proved that the motorcyclist was driving well over the speed limit and that he had hit me, not the other way around. Now, sadly, he was going 47 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, and I'd only been going 17. So the judge dropped all charges. And at the end of the court proceeding, I remember the judge saying, take this little girl home. She's been through enough. Now, I wish I could say the story ended there, but of course it didn't. Shortly after the criminal trial, the family of the young motorcyclist sued my mother and me for what could only be described as a ridiculous amount of money. Now, my mom was terrified that we'd lose the only asset she had, which was our family home. And I have to tell you, my mom didn't always handle that stress very well. In fact, I can tell you at one point, she looked at me and said, well, you know, because of you, we may have to pitch a tent on the high school football field, because she was worried we'd lose the only asset she had, which was our family home. Now, as you can imagine, those words cut deeply into my psyche. And many times families can say things that hurt the most. I had to live with the fact that it was going to be my fault if we lost our home. And I can tell you, my mom lived with that fear for many, many years until the case was finally settled at the 11th hour by our car insurance company, which had come to my defense. So after losing my dad, suffering severe financial difficulties, and enduring both a criminal and a civil lawsuit, these lessons about money were just not lost on me. So following the accident, I became what could only be described as a workaholic, maintaining several jobs so I could earn enough to pay back the mortgage from my mom's house and put myself through college. Because I quickly realized the only way to get out of poverty was going to be to work hard and get a good education. So by the time I was 22, I had accumulated a nest egg of about $22,000, which was no small amount of money in 1979. When people ask, how did I do that? Well, I tell them I saved, I scraped, and believe it or not, I ended up going on the Wheel of Fortune and I won. Now, keep in mind, my husband, Bob, had asked me to marry him. And as we all know, the bride's parents are supposed to pay for the wedding. Well, my mom had no more money to pay for the wedding than she had when I needed her to pay for my defense. So one of my friends, Marie, said that Wheel of Fortune was doing tryouts for Brides Week. So I went up to Los Angeles, I tried out, and guess what? I got on the show. And ironically, the puzzle that I won at the end, the last spin, was basically, it was down in the dumps. I always tell people you just can't make this up. So shortly before we got married, I invested $3,000 and bought a townhouse in Southern California with a friend of mine. And that investment worked out really well. But shortly after we got married, my husband, Bob, and I, we entrusted the balance of our savings to a stockbroker, assuming we were being smart by investing our wealth for growth. The stockbroker ended up dividing our money into 4 different investments, none of which were appropriate for us. Unfortunately, also, all 4 investments went belly up in a very short period of time, and we lost every cent we'd entrusted to him. Our first investment was completely gone. As you can imagine, I was completely devastated. While it might not have been a lot of money to our stockbroker, it was everything to us. And it represented years and years of hard work and sacrifice. I felt stupid. I was betrayed. I felt embarrassed. And from that day forward, I made it my personal mission to learn everything I could about money and investing. I was determined nothing like that was ever going to happen to me or anybody I cared about. And that's what led me to the financial planning industry. Now, I've shared my story many times, never to garner pity, but rather explain the importance of good advice and good financial planning. I learned personally from an early age what poor financial planning, or worse yet, what no financial planning can do to a family. And so those lessons of poverty have never vanished from my memory. I know firsthand that without money, I could have landed in jail. With no ability to prove my innocence, my very freedom could have been taken away from me. Accidents, they just happen. They happen in an instant. And without good planning, an accident that results in a civil lawsuit can threaten to take everything away that you've worked so hard to achieve. And that's why I call this presentation First Things First. I learned the importance of anticipating and planning for the potential pitfalls. That's one of the most important things that you can do in your planning. Why? Because life happens. Accidents happen. Stock markets happen. Markets go up, markets go down. I've experienced all of this myself. And through it all, I discovered that it can often be unplanned events that can create the most stress in your life and devastate your well-laid plans and ultimately your financial future. As I mentioned, those early experiences propelled me to become a financial advisor. And for the past 30 plus years, I've dedicated the better part of my life to helping people just like you with their financial planning. I've learned that comprehensive financial planning, where you consider both sides of the equation, the money management side and the risk side of the balance sheet, can be the key to managing potential pitfalls that can disrupt your ability to enjoy your future. When you consider risks that can be lurking out there, you can help alleviate some of those worries that maybe they wake you up in the middle of the night. Because let's face it, the fear of the unknown is often the worst kind of uncertainty. Unfortunately, I have found that many people haven't considered that bad things can sometimes happen to very good people, and there are things you can do to help alleviate some or maybe all of those negative consequences for things like car accidents or other unplanned events. And that's why I created this video. The advisor who invited you to view this wants to be sure that you have considered all of life's potential pitfalls, either known or unknown. And they want you to be prepared for unforeseen circumstances that might come your way. Ultimately, the advisor who invited you wants you to have an amazing life and the ability to enjoy your retirement years and everything else you worked so hard to achieve. So in closing, by sharing my story and the lessons I've learned about money, I hope you've been able to see that being intentional about your financial planning, it can be the key that unlocks the ability to live the life you've always dreamed of and you're working so hard to create. So with that in mind, I encourage you to review the financial planning you've already done, maybe through a new lens, or if you haven't done any comprehensive planning, now's the time to reach out to the financial advisor who invited you to this program and ask him or her to provide you with the risk quantification questionnaire that they have available to give to you. Now, what is that? Well, in essence, I created a checklist you can go through to determine whether or not you've had areas of your financial planning that need to be addressed. And I thought I'd go through some of those checklist items right now so you can see how important taking this next step might be to your overall financial planning. So when you get the checklist, you're going to notice the first sheet is designed to review the various types of insurances you should consider, or maybe you already have. So the first section is all about life insurance. Now, this might be a little touchy, but as you can imagine, I'm pretty passionate about having enough life insurance, especially if you have children. I know in my case, it sure would have helped my family a great deal if my dad had had more than a $10,000 life insurance policy. Now, that said, a lot of people rely on the insurance that they have through their employees. But what happens to your family if you quit, if you get furloughed, or worse yet, if you become uninsurable for some reason? Next, I think it's really important to do what I refer to as a 360-degree review of your entire family. Starting with your parents, do they have sufficient life insurance so that if one of them dies, the survivor of the two of them will be okay. As I've said before, my father was very uninsured, so my mom and all of us kids, well, we suffered. And then what about your children, especially if you have grandchildren? In my case, I have one son and three grandsons. So years ago, my husband and I decided to secure life insurance policies for both our son and our daughter-in-law. Now, why did we do that? Well, in our case, at that time, our son was in the Air Force and he was deploying to the Middle East pretty often. I realized that the amount of life insurance he was entitled to from the military, well, that would have been in no way enough to care for his wife and their three children if something happened to him. Well, I knew if my daughter-in-law died, our son would still have to go to work, and there was a chance he might have to deploy to the Middle East. So I wanted to make sure there will be plenty of money available to care for our grandchildren. Now, another question on the checklist talks about long-term care insurance. This too can be really important to make sure there are funds available for a possible nursing home stay without impacting the family's future. Now, the unfortunate thing I've seen is that most people don't think about purchasing long-term care insurance until they've had an illness or they have symptoms of some kind, and then they can't get it. So I encourage you to go through this sheet with the advisor who invited you to view this video and make decisions that are appropriate for your family. You don't want to wait for an unfortunate circumstances to happen before you address all these areas. Remember, first things first means planning now before anything happens. Now, the second page of the checklist is about how to protect yourself from liability risks. As you heard in my story, after my car accident, my mother and I were sued for a very large amount of money. And as I said, my mom worried that we'd lose the only asset she had, which was our family home. So I'd really encourage you to review how much umbrella liability insurance you have on homeowners policy and your automobile policies. In our case, back then, we didn't know anything about having umbrella liability insurance, but it would have certainly helped alleviate some of my mom had while we went through that long legal process. That said, teenage drivers tend to add a level of risk, so one risk mitigation strategy I always recommend to people is to buy your teenage driver an unlimited Uber account. Now, next on the checklist are questions about how you have your assets currently titled. Now, typically having all of your assets titled in your personal name may not be the best way to protect them. For instance, if you own rental properties, you might want to ask your attorney about titling those real estate properties in a separate legal entity, like maybe an LLC. And finally, there's some basic questions about the current status of your estate planning. 1, do you have wills and trusts? 2, are they current? Do you have financial powers of attorney and healthcare directives in case you become sick and can't make financial or medical decisions for yourself? In light of tough times, either now or yet to come, it's really imperative that you have your estate planning documents in all those healthcare directives reviewed and updated. There are a number of other questions on the questionnaire, but the bottom line is I would encourage you to work with the advisor who shared this with you, get with them and go through the questionnaire together and review your risk profile. Basically, ask yourself the question is, what types of circumstances could potentially happen and maybe disrupt your plans for experiencing your preferred future or maybe your dream retirement? So as you can imagine, my best advice to you right now is that as you build your financial foundation, it's just really imperative to make sure you protect yourself and those you care about for unforeseen circumstances that could result in risk to your hard-earned assets. So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. I truly hope my story will inspire you to review the planning you've done thus far and make sure you've addressed any risks that could come along and disrupt your plans. And more importantly, create a plan to live the life of your dreams. My wish for you is to have you meet with your financial advisor who cared enough about you to share this video with you as soon as possible so you can work on risk mitigation strategies to protect your life and your dream retirement. Thank you so much.